This was a story my uncle would always tell me as a kid during summer vacations to entertain us children. The following was treated as the unadulterated truth by the entire family, especially my uncle, who was generally discouraged by the family from telling anyone. I can possibly do justice to how my uncle would tell it, but here goes. Be uncle. 12 years old. Growing up in shitty suburban town in northern Ontario. For privacy reasons, I won't say the name. Growing up there meant complete boredom for any young person involved. The most you could do was play baseball 5 or fish in one of the local rivers. Kids who didn't start underage drinking or narcotics at a young age were drawn to the woods as a form of entertainment. The town was spread out but not heavily populated, just meant there were a bunch of empty houses and empty lots. Uncle has best friend called T, and a younger sister called S. Obviously not going to use real names. These kids would fuck around constantly in the woods, blocking up rivers and making shitty forts that would collapse within months. Uncle had a fascination with mapping out the whole place, constantly plotting new ones whenever something new was discovered. Section of the town that was not so populated was affectionately and historically referred to as Weston. Thus began the stories of the Western Manimal. An urban legend in the shitty suburban town that went way back. It went by other names, but my uncle's generation called it that after the TV show Manimal that was popular at the time. One neighbor owned the DVDs of the first season he ordered from the States, would have TV parties with the show. In the western section of the town, dogs would show up dead and trash was rummaged through on an almost weekly basis. That combined with the legend of a wild man or animal person in the town made kids go crazy with their adventuring trying to find it. Senile old people in the town would tell them stories of seeing a pale humanoid figure in the woods. Uncle and friends wouldn't always believe them, but sometimes they would take what they say to heart. Parents were advised to educate their kids on the dangers of the woods, not because of the legend of the Manimal, but because there were some genuinely dangerous bears and coyotes in the woods that could fuck a kid up. Kids played this off as protecting us from the Manimal. Imagination and fear in the kids got so bad that some teachers had to sit all the kids down and tell them the Manimal was a stupid old legend the town made up generations ago. This just made my uncle and his friend, T, want to prove it even more. One day, a kid from their class says their dog went missing and is asking everyone if they saw it. Uncle thinks that the Western Manimal must have gotten it. Decide to check their maps to see which places in the woods they haven't gone before. One big old hilly area in the middle that they generally stayed away from, about 1 kilometer wide. Only reason they hadn't gone there yet was because one of the rivers that flows around the town wraps around it and gets too wide and deep to wade across easily. The other side of the area was thick brush, that no one made a path through, also couldn't get through it easily. Decide the time is now. If the Western Manimal isn't there, then it doesn't exist. Being 12 years old and stupid, they decide to begin their expedition to find the Manimal, including sandwiches, a carton of milk, and 4 cans of Pepsi. No flashlights because autism, but bring binoculars to search for it. T decides to include his little sister S, who was a couple years younger than them. The 3 begin construction on a shitty boat made of cheap wood and glue. Ended up being more of a raft that just looked like a boat, at least that was how my uncle described it. This is what they'd use to cross the river since it would take too long to cross the other way through the thick brush. They grab 2 paddles and put on their stupid red and blue ball caps to begin their epic journey. They leave just before dusk one day without telling their parents, because you could do anything as a child back then. They start walking, carrying their dog shit boat raft, and struggle all the way through the woods. Past their forts that saw many a night in battle. Past the old gravel pit where they'd light gasoline on fire for fun. Eventually make it to the river, probably 40 feet to cross at this section. Whip out their paddles and start paddling. All 3 pile into the hull. Way too much weight. The fucking boat starts leaking as soon as they paddle. Being stubborn autistic kids, they think it will make it there and back. By the time they get to the other side, the boat's completely sunk and they're all wet. Still have some daylight left and decide they'll just head back through the thick brush afterwards despite the time it would take. T tells his sister to check out the other side of the area, while the two of them look up around the hills. The two march up the dry gravel hills to a miniature cliff face on the other side. They're looking down for any signs but can't make anything out. Patiently stay quiet and wait for us to come back. Eventually they hear something down the cliff side of the hill. They both look and see something moving down there near a hole in another smaller hill. Something's moving by stream of flowing water. Uncle puts his binoculars up to his eyes. When telling the story, Uncle always chokes up at this part. Looks down at a small greenish-gray humanoid, completely naked, roughly the same size as my uncle, about 5 feet. Incredibly skinny, arms that were too long for its body. It had nasty matted black hair on its head, at least 1 foot long, wavy and scruffy, obscuring its face. It had cuts and bruises all over its dirty naked body. It almost looked emaciated. It was dragging something behind it with its incredibly long fingers and even longer overgrown nails. A cut-open golden retriever, definitely the missing dog that belonged to my uncle's classmates. It stopped for a while as T and my uncle were dead silent. Then it looked up at them. My uncle was still staring at this thing through his binoculars. With what little sunlight was left he could make out its face. He always described it the exact same way. Its head was way too round and big for its body, almost spherical with an underdeveloped forehead. Super skinny neck with what appeared to be a giant Adam's apple. The long scruffy hair on its head was stained with blood and dirt. It rolled down its face and obscured some of it. Its eyes were bulbous, black and sticking out too far. A mouth that was way too wide to be normal, going from one side of the head to the other. Its skin on its face was darker and really tight, almost stretched. It didn't have a fucking nose. It didn't have any fucking eyebrows. It didn't have any fucking ears. My uncle has no idea how long he looked at the thing. Eventually it calmly walked off towards its hole in the ground. T was shaken and tried to get my uncle to talk. T didn't get as good of a look on the thing, but he did see its shape. Uncle was borderline unresponsive. T shoved him down the hill. They made a fuck ton of noise but needed to find S as soon as possible and fuck off back home. The sun is done going down at this point, and it starts to get dark. They start running towards the other side of the area where they sent S. T is starting to panic because they can't find her. Uncle starts to become more responsive as they try to look for her. They don't want to make noise in case they attract that thing. T starts whisper shouting, calling out his sister's name. My uncle stops him from making noise. They can hear the thing from the hole start walking towards them in the brush. They know it's not S, because of the noises it is making. They sprint back the way they came, around the opposite side of the area closer to the thick brush. They hide in some bushes for a bit, once they're on the other side to catch their breath. S isn't calling out to them, but if she was lost in the woods she should be making noise. This makes T scared as hell for a sister. A quicker way through the brush was closer to where they saw the thing dragging the dog. They devise a plan to get home as quickly as possible, and tell their parents so they can come to the woods with guns and find her. They wait a few more minutes as it gets darker and darker. The two start running for the brush but hear a noise. Both freeze, duck behind a fallen tree. The thing from before comes out into a clearing, can't see my uncle or T. It's dragging something else. A much smaller dog, looked brown but couldn't make it out since it was almost completely dark. The little dog is bound with some sort of rope or crude vines. It's squealing and barking up a storm. The thing starts to torture the little dog, cutting it with its nails in certain spots and pinning its head down. All the while this thing bobbed its head up and down and made a raspy laughing-like sound. Could barely make out that it was smiling. It started skinning this dog alive and tearing at its meat. Eventually the dog stops moving as the thing begins to eat it. The two slowly begin inching away, trying to make as little noise as possible. As they're walking away, my uncle looks behind them. The thing is standing straight up looking directly at them. Uncle panics and screams and starts pushing T to run. The thing begins to chase them. All my uncle can do is run. he gets split up from T. After a few minutes of running, he was still in the area and didn't make it through the thick brush, only ran along the edge of the area. He can hear T screaming off in the distance with some other inhuman sounds that he couldn't place. Uncle tries to run to find S while the thing is distracted. Runs to right where they sent S when they showed up. Not a trace. Eventually he finds her backpack. Slightly ripped on one side. He gets worried. He begins to look further in the direction of the backpack. Runs past some trees. T's screaming is starting to get louder. Uncle sees something small and long underneath a branch. It's a fucking arm. It's S's fucking arm. Wrenched right off of her body. Next to it was a shard of her shirt. Uncle freaks out. Begins running blindly. Trees and bushes start cutting at his face and legs. He keeps tripping and stumbling in the pitch-black woods. After running for what seems like hours, he finds a dirt road he recognizes. He begins sprinting alongside it in the direction of home. He hears more screaming but isn't sure if it's real or just his imagination. Running and bleeding at the same time is exhausting him. He eventually makes it to the town hall and goes the usual route from there to his house. Uncle runs into his porch at full speed and collapses while trying to open the door. Around this point there's a gap in my uncle's memory. He can't visualize any of this, but it's what his parents, my grandparents, told him. From my grandparents' perspective, he had been out playing for much longer than he should have. Once the sun went down, they called all of their neighbors to see if they knew where he was. Eventually they called the police and asked for an officer to come to their house to help find my uncle. When they were talking to the officer about what they should do, my uncle ran into the porch, then ran into the door. He was bleeding heavily from cuts on his legs and one on his arm. He was completely unresponsive and delirious, presumably from the running and adrenaline overdose. He was unresponsive and borderline comatose for the next several days. Grandparents thought he had his head, but local doctors said it was more likely symptomatic of a traumatic experience. My uncle stayed in his bedroom until he started talking. This is when my uncle starts remembering things. T and S never came home that night. Their parents weren't the worrying type and didn't report it till the next day. My uncle was unresponsive during the search period, so no one got any information out of him on what happened to T and S. By the time my uncle was back to normal, some cops asked him what he was doing that night and what happened to T and S. At the time my uncle tried to convince himself it wasn't real. He also didn't want to get in trouble since it was his idea to look for the Western Manimal. He kept his mouth shut. To this day he says it was the biggest mistake of his life, but he was too traumatized to tell the truth. Kids in his class begin to spread rumors that the Manimal must have got T and S, that it climbed into their rooms in the middle of the night and killed them. Teachers and adults told these kids to be respectful to T and S. A few weeks later my father was born and my grandparents wanted a better life for their two sons in a bigger city. They moved shortly after and my uncle never heard from T or S's family ever again. He claimed that he suffered from serious stress after the incident, that he keeps having flashes of guilt of what happened to his friends. My uncle still told us the story though, much to our older relatives' dismay. I think it was therapeutic for him to get out his feelings about the incident rather than just repressing all of it. He left the gory bits out when we were younger, but as we got older he told us more and more details of the story. He would avoid details of the dogs and the arm, but the way he described that thing was always the same. It was burned into my imagination as a kid and would sometimes give me nightmares. Now that I'm older I'm not afraid of the story. It's just one of the saddest and most disturbing family stories I've ever heard. I've never really believed in the paranormal or the supernatural, but every time my uncle tells me the story and describes the disgusting, sadistic black eyes of this thing, I believe him.